The Merwick estate did not fall all at once. It went the way old houses always do, quietly, room by room, pride by pride. Then, until the morning came when the housekeeper informed Lady Merwick that there was no longer enough coal to heat both the east wing and the kitchen, and a choice had to be made. They chose the kitchen. The east wing went cold, then the library, then the drawing room that had once hosted 3 earls and a cabinet minister. By the autumn of 1851, Penelope Merwick had grown so accustomed to the cold that she stopped noticing it. She was 26 years old, the younger of 2 daughters, and she had learned long ago that noticing things was a luxury reserved for people whose fathers still had money. Her sister Florinda had always been the beautiful one. Not beautiful in the quiet, forgettable way that required a second look, but beautiful in the immediate, undeniable way that made men forget what they had been about to say. Florinda knew this. She had known it since she was 14, and the vicar's son had walked into a fence post while watching her cross the churchyard. She wore her beauty the way other women wore jewelry, consciously, deliberately, always aware of the effect. Penelope wore a wool dress with a fraying hem and kept the household accounts. There were, by October, 17 outstanding debts attached to the Merwick name. Penelope had listed them in a small leather notebook she kept beneath her pillow. The butcher, the coal merchant, 2 separate tailors who had made the mistake of extending credit to Florinda, the farrier, a London solicitor whose fees had been accumulating interest since 1848, and others smaller and more humiliating still. The total was not catastrophic by the standards of ruined families. It was simply enough to be ruinous. Her father, Sir Aldous Merwick, had stopped looking at the notebook. He had, in fact, stopped looking at most things that required confronting the reality of their situation. He spent his mornings in the old study, with the curtains drawn, and a glass of claret that had been stretched so thin with water it was barely distinguishable from coloured rain. It was into this house, cold, quiet, proud in the way of things that have no choice but to remain proud, that a man arrived on a grey Thursday morning claiming to be a steward. He came in a hired cart, not a carriage. That was the first thing Penelope noticed. She had been in the kitchen garden when she heard the wheels on the gravel, and she straightened up from the rosemary bed to look. Because hired carts did not usually come to Merwick unless someone was collecting something. The man who climbed down was perhaps 32 or 33, with the kind of lean, unhurried movements that belonged either to men who had never had anything to prove or to men who had already proven everything and no longer needed to show it. He wore plain dark clothing. Well made, Penelope noted, despite the simplicity. And he carried a leather satchel that suggested he was here for business rather than social calls. He gave his name as Mr. Davenport. He said he represented Lord Cassius Aldermere, the Earl of Fenbrook, who was seeking a competent household manager for his estate at Aldermere Park, approximately 12 miles north. The current housekeeper had retired. Lord Aldermere required someone capable of overseeing a staff of 14, managing accounts, coordinating with the estate's land steward, and maintaining the house in a condition appropriate to receive guests. The position paid £90 a year. Penelope was still holding a bunch of rosemary. She had not moved during this speech. She had listened with the still, careful attention of someone accustomed to receiving information that required immediate processing. And when Mr. Davenport finished, she said, in a perfectly level voice, "Why are you bringing this offer to Merwick?" He met her eyes without the faint, apologetic flicker she had learned to watch for, in men who were delivering news that carried some implication of diminishment. Lord Aldermere was informed that Merwick had produced 2 daughters of appropriate education and social standing. He preferred to offer the position privately before advertising it more widely. He is offering the position to a gentleman's daughter. he is offering the position to whoever is qualified to fill it. Penelope looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Please come inside. I'll arrange for tea." She did not tell her father immediately. She served Mr. Davenport tea in the front parlour, the one room that still had enough furniture to suggest a functioning household, and she asked him questions. Practical ones. What were the current outstanding maintenance issues at Aldermere Park? How many of the 14 staff were indoor? How many outdoor? What was the budget cycle for household expenditures? And did the estate operate on quarterly accounts or annual review? Mr. Davenport answered each question without hesitation and without the expression of mild surprise she had learned to expect when she asked men questions that required them to take her seriously. He simply answered. When she asked about the library catalogue, he described its current state of disorganization. When she asked about the tenant cottages visible from the east approach, he confirmed that 2 needed roofing attention before winter. She realized at some point during this conversation that she was enjoying herself. That was unusual enough to notice. Florinda appeared at 11:15, still in her morning dress, which on Florinda looked like something from a painting. She stopped in the doorway of the parlour and took in Mr. Davenport with the automatic assessment she applied to all men, the way a merchant assesses incoming merchandise. "I didn't know we had company," she said. "Mr. Davenport is here about a position," Penelope said. "A household manager role at Aldermere Park." The shift in Florinda's expression was minute but legible to anyone who had spent 26 years reading it. A household manager, her interest, which had briefly sharpened at the appearance of an unfamiliar man, recalibrated itself accordingly. "How tedious," Florinda said pleasantly, and withdrew. Penelope watched her sister leave and felt nothing in particular. The word tedious had been aimed, she knew, not at Mr. Davenport, but at her, at the implication that Penelope would consider such a thing, that the younger Miss Merwick, with her fraying hem and her leather notebook, might lower herself to work. She turned back to Mr. Davenport and said, "I'll take the position." He nodded, as if this were the expected conclusion to a business meeting, which perhaps it was. He told her Lord Aldermere expected to meet the new household manager within the fortnight to confirm the appointment. He stood, collected his satchel, thanked her for the tea, and left. Penelope sat in the quiet parlour for a long moment after the hired cart had pulled back down the drive. £90 a year. It would not clear all 17 debts, but it would begin to. She found her father in the study and told him what she had agreed to. He looked at her over the rim of his glass with an expression she had no easy name for. Grief and relief, and something that might have been shame, all compounded into a silence that went on too long. "Penelope," he said finally. "It's a good household," she said. 12 miles. I can be home in under an hour if needed." He said nothing more. She took that as assent. She arrived at Aldermere Park on a Tuesday in the small travelling case that held everything she considered essential, which was not much. The house was older than she'd expected, and larger, a stone manor set back from the road with a copper beech that had been growing in the front courtyard long enough to have opinions about the matter. The housekeeper's rooms were in the east wing, modest but adequate, with a window that looked out over the kitchen garden, and, beyond it, a long field where the morning fog was still settling. The staff received her with the polite wariness that staff reserve for new authority figures, waiting to see whether she would be the kind who inspected gloves and counted silver, or the kind who understood that a household ran on human beings and not on enforcement. She spent her first day learning their names and not inspecting anything. She met the head groom, Hatch, who was 50 and laconic, and would tell her everything she needed to know about the estate if she asked the right questions and didn't waste his time. she met the cook, Mrs. Baird, who had been at Aldermere for 19 years and whose opinion of the previous household arrangements was communicated entirely through the set of her shoulders. She met the 3 housemaids, the 2 footmen, the laundry woman, and the kitchen girl, whose name was Agnes and who was 12, and had apparently been employed primarily to carry things and look small. By evening, she had a working map of the household's actual functioning. Not the theoretical structure written in the old household book, but the real one, with its improvised arrangements and its interdependencies, and its small dignities that needed to be respected if one wanted the place to run. Lord Aldermere she had not met. She understood he was in residence. She had been told he would confirm her appointment in due course. She had not pressed the matter. She had, instead, identified the roof of the West Laundry, which was developing a slow leak, and had asked Hatch to recommend a local builder. She was examining the leak in question, standing in the laundry with a candle, looking up at a water stain that had the resigned expression of a problem that had been ignored for 2 winters, when she heard someone behind her and turned. The man in the doorway was not a footman. He was wearing a coat that had seen outdoor work, and there was mud on his boots, and he was looking at the ceiling with the focused attention of someone doing rapid arithmetic. "The rafter," he said. "Second from the left. You can see the discoloration from here." Penelope looked. He was correct. "Yes," she said, "I noticed that. I've asked Hatch about a builder. Morrow in the village is competent. The one they used last year is not." He was still looking at the ceiling. "He'll charge less, but you'll pay twice." "Thank you. I'll ask Hatch to contact Morrow." She paused. "Are you from the estate?" He looked at her then. He had grey eyes and the look of a man who had recently been tired for a long time and was only now, cautiously, beginning not to be. "In a manner of speaking," he said. "Cassius Aldermere." Penelope did not blink. She had learned early that the most useful response to surprises was to appear unsurprised. "My lord," she said, "I apologize for not meeting you formally when you arrived. I was in the North Field." He said it without apology in his voice, which she found she preferred to the alternative. "The roof is more urgent than formal introductions," she said. Something shifted in his expression. Not a smile. Exactly. More like the precondition of one. "Yes," he said. "I've been told you've already spoken to all the staff. I needed to understand how the house actually functions before I could do anything useful. And how does it function? Better than it looks from the household book, and worse than it should. Mrs. Baird has been absorbing 3 roles since the last undercook left in August. I'd like to advertise the position. Hatch is managing the gig horses with 1 less groom than the stable requires. And Agnes is 12, which is too young to be carrying coal." He was quiet for a moment. "You've been here one day. I notice things quickly." He looked at her with an attention that was not the usual kind. Not the glancing assessment she was used to. The automatic inventory that men performed without quite realizing they were doing it. He looked at her the way she had looked at the laundry ceiling, like someone identifying where the actual problem was. "The previous household manager," he said, "was here for 6 months before he raised the question of the undercook. Perhaps he was waiting until he knew you well enough to tell you. And you are not." "I don't think waiting makes roofs stop leaking," she said. He was quiet again. Then he said, "I'll confirm your appointment in writing tomorrow. Mrs. Baird will know where to find me if you need anything before then." He looked once more at the ceiling. "Get Morrow." He left. Penelope stood in the cold laundry for a moment, listening to the distant sound of boots on stone, and then she raised the candle again and went back to examining the rafter. The weeks that followed had a shape she had not expected. She had prepared herself for distance, the formal structure of employer and employee. the careful maintenance of appropriate levels of address and interaction. She had been in houses where the housekeeper existed in a parallel world, visible and necessary, but categorically separate. Aldermere Park was not that kind of house. Lord Aldermere had a habit of appearing in places where the practical problems of the estate were being addressed. He was in the kitchen when the coal delivery was short, and the argument with the coal merchant needed arbitrating. He was in the east corridor when the cornice came away from the wall, and 3 footmen were trying to decide what to do about it. He was on one memorable Tuesday afternoon. In the attic, where Penelope had gone to assess what could be sold and what needed to be preserved, and where she found him sitting on a trunk, reading a letter with the expression of a man who had retreated there on purpose. She had started to withdraw immediately. "Don't," he said, without looking up. "You're here to work. I'm in the way. I'll move." "You're not in my way," she said, which was true. He was in the far corner, and she needed to be in the center of the room. He folded the letter. "What are you assessing?" she told him. He listened in the way he always listened, with his full attention, which she had come to understand was not a social performance, but simply how he was. He asked questions that were useful. Which pieces had provenance value, which were merely sentimental, whether the old travel trunks were worth the leather merchant's trouble. They spent an hour in the attic together. She catalogued. He occasionally moved things for her. He did not make it a large gesture. At some point, she realized she had stopped using his title in her head. Not aloud, she maintained that scrupulously, conscious that the boundary mattered and that she was the one responsible for maintaining it. But somewhere in the interior operations of her mind, he had become simply Cassius, which was not something she had planned. The letter, she learned eventually, had been from his solicitor. The estate was encumbered by debt his father had accumulated over 20 years of determined optimism and poor investments. Aldermere Park itself was sound, the land was good, the tenants reliable, the house structurally solid despite its maintenance needs. But the outstanding accounts were substantial, and the estate's income, while sufficient for ordinary operating costs, could not simultaneously service the debt and improve the property. She learned this not because he told her directly, but because she understood accounts, and the household accounts of Aldermere were not, on reflection, fully separated from the estate accounts, and a household manager who could read numbers would see the shape of things, whether she was meant to or not. She did not mention that she had seen it. She simply, methodically, began finding efficiencies. She renegotiated the household supplier contracts. She identified 3 members of staff who were paid from the household budget, but were functionally serving the estate, and flagged the discrepancy so they could be properly recategorized. She found, in a drawer of the old household book, a record of a grazing lease that had lapsed, and that could, with minimal administrative effort, be renewed at the updated market rate. The renewed lease added £40 annually to the estate income. It was not nothing. He found out about it when the land steward mentioned it, apparently with some surprise. He came to find her in the housekeeper's rooms, where she was writing the weekly supply order. The Thornfield lease, he said. It was listed in the 1843 household register and hadn't been mentioned since. I assumed it had been overlooked rather than deliberately abandoned. He looked at her with the expression she had come to recognize, the one she had initially misread as assessment and had gradually understood was something closer to. Not wonder, exactly. More like recognition. The look of someone encountering a thing they had not known they were looking for. "How did you find it?" "I was reading the old registers. I read everything when I arrive somewhere new. It helps me understand where things have gone wrong and for how long." He sat down, which he did not usually do in her room. How long had the lease been lapsed? since 1847. Someone let it go during that year's administrative troubles and no one picked it up again? She paused. It was a busy year. Yes, he said quietly. It was. Something passed between them in the silence that followed. Not what she had seen in parlours and drawing rooms, the calculated exchange of interest and social currency. Something quieter than that. The acknowledgement of two people who had both spent time managing difficulty without the luxury of making it visible. Miss Merwick, he said, my lord, you have been here 7 weeks. 8. As of yesterday, he was quiet. Then, the household is different since you came. Mrs. Baird said something to me last week. She said, the house felt thinking about. Since, she said, the house felt inhabited again. He looked at his hands, briefly, and then back at her. I didn't realize it had stopped. She did not know what to say to that. She was not accustomed to being told that her presence made a difference that was not purely administrative. The new undercook begins Monday, she said finally. I think you'll find Mrs. Baird's demeanor improves considerably. He almost smiled. I look forward to it. The visit from Florinda came on a Saturday in December, unannounced, which was Florinda's way of doing most things. She arrived in a hired carriage, their father's old one, Penelope realized, which meant he had lent it, with 2 hat boxes and the expression of someone who had come to conduct an inspection. She was, as always, beautiful. The hall footman, Thomas, who was 22 and perfectly sensible, failed for approximately 4 seconds to announce her properly. Florinda swept through the hall and found Penelope coming down the main staircase with a ledger under her arm. And she looked at her sister the way she always looked at her, with the slightly pitying affection of someone who cannot understand why a person would choose to carry ledgers when the alternative was to be carried instead. You look well, Florinda said, which from Florinda meant, you look less like the person I expected to find in this situation. You should have written, Penelope said. I would have arranged rooms. I wanted to see it naturally. Florinda turned slowly in the hall, taking in the stone floors and the copper chandelier and the portrait gallery, visible through the open door to the left. It's rather grand, isn't it? It's a working estate. Does he entertain, Lord Aldermere? Penelope looked at her sister steadily. Not frequently, but he's here in residence. Yes. Florinda smiled, and it was the smile Penelope had known since childhood. The one that arrived when Florinda had decided something, and was simply waiting for the world to arrange itself accordingly. I would so love to see the house properly. Perhaps you could introduce me. The introduction happened at dinner, which Florinda managed to be present for by the simple method of not leaving. Lord Aldermere was courteous. He asked appropriate questions about the Merwick family. He did not, as far as Penelope could observe, perform the 4-second failure that Thomas had performed in the hall. He was, she noticed, watching her more than he was watching Florinda. She did not let herself make too much of that. She had been in enough rooms to know that a man could watch a woman for any number of reasons, and that the reason you hoped for was rarely the right assumption. After dinner, Florinda found Penelope in the linen room, where Penelope had retreated on the grounds that the linen inventory was overdue. He's remarkable looking, Florinda said. He's a good employer, Penelope. Florinda leaned against the shelf. You know he's going to need to marry someone. Most people do. Someone appropriate. Someone who understands this kind of household. She paused, and her voice carried the particular gentle condescension of a woman who believes she is being kind. Not someone in the position you're in. Penelope folded a pillowcase and set it on the appropriate shelf. I'm doing the linen inventory. Did you need something? Florinda left the next morning. Penelope stood in the kitchen courtyard and watched the carriage disappear down the drive and felt something she could not quite name. A complex pressure behind the sternum, part grief and part relief and part something that had no good word for it in English. She did not want to want things. She had no right to want. She went back inside and finished the linen inventory. It was Hatch who told her, in the flat, factual way that Hatch told everything, that Lord Aldermere had ridden out that morning to meet with his solicitor in the village, and that the meeting had lasted 3 hours, and that, when he came back, he had put the horse away himself, which he only did when he was thinking hard about something. She did not ask what he was thinking about. It was not her business. She was here to run the household and find the overlooked grazing leases and make sure Agnes was not carrying coal. But that evening, when she was sitting with the week's accounts in the housekeeper's room and the fire had burned down to coals, she heard footsteps in the corridor and then a knock. "Come in," she said, because it was her room and she was allowed to say that. He came in and he stood by the door with his coat still on, as if he had not yet decided whether he was staying. She looked up from the accounts and waited. "The solicitor has identified a path through the debt," he said. "It will take 6 years of careful management and no significant unexpected costs." "That's achievable," she said. "The estate income is stable. The Thornfield lease renewal will help." "Yes." He was quiet. "He also told me something else." She waited. "My father's will contains a condition I had hoped was unenforceable. It is not, as it turns out, unenforceable." He looked at her with the grey eyes that she had stopped being unaffected by somewhere around the 6th week, which she had been carefully not acknowledging. "The estate passes to me, conditionally upon my marriage, before my 35th birthday. I turn 35 in March." The fire shifted. A coal settled. "I see," she said. "I have been in this house for 4 years managing it alone because I did not wish to marry someone for expediency." He said this as if he were reading something aloud and was not certain of the reception. "I have found, in the past 8 weeks, that my view of what constitutes expediency has changed considerably." She was very still. "I am aware," he said, "that this is not a conventional offer. I am aware that I am your employer, and that this conversation places you in a position that is not entirely fair. If your answer is no, your position here is unchanged. I give you my word on that." "That's a difficult word to give," she said quietly. "Under the circumstances, yes, but I give it." The fire was very quiet. She thought of 17 debts in a leather notebook. She thought of her father in the cold study with the watered claret. She thought of Florinda saying, "Not someone in the position you're in," with the gentle, pitying accuracy of someone who believed that love sorted itself according to social category, like laundry. She thought of an hour in the attic with a man who moved trunks without making it a gesture. She thought of grey eyes looking at water-stained rafters. She thought of Mrs. Baird saying the house felt inhabited again, and of the fact that she, Penelope, had felt the same thing. "You are asking," she said carefully, "because you need to marry before March." "I am asking," he said, "because I do not wish to imagine conducting the next 6 years of careful management without you. The March deadline simply forced me to say so." He paused. "I recognize that these two things sound identical from the outside." "They do," she agreed. "From the inside," he said, "they are entirely different." She looked at him for a long time. He did not fidget. He did not look away. He stood there in his outdoor coat and waited with the patience of a man who had learned that some things could not be hurried. "I would need to clear 17 debts," she said. He blinked. "I beg your pardon. My family's debts. 17. I have them written down." She paused. "Before I agree to anything, I would need to know that they would be settled, not as a condition of, not transactionally, but because I cannot agree to build something new while leaving that weight behind." "Yes," he said without hesitating. "Of course." She looked at him for another moment. Then she said, I would also need you to speak to my father directly. He will want to form his own view of your intentions. I intend to. And Agnes should not be carrying coal. Agnes, he repeated carefully, will never carry coal again. I will put that in writing if you require it. She felt something loosen in her chest. Something she had held tightly for a long time, through cold rooms and careful economies, and the particular discipline of expecting nothing. It did not loosen all at once. It loosened the way old houses warm up after a long winter. Slowly, from the center outward, room by room, until the cold that has been the condition of everything becomes, instead, simply a memory of what it was like before. Cassius, she said. It was the first time she had used his name aloud. He went very still. Yes, she said. My answer is yes. He did not sweep across the room. He did not make it large. He simply let out a breath, long and quiet, as though he had been holding it since October. And he sat down in the chair across from her desk, and they stayed like that for a while in the warm, near dark, two people who had found each other in the only way that actually lasts, by being in the same rooms, doing the same work, paying attention. The 17 debts were cleared by February. Sir Aldermere Merwick came to Aldermere Park in January, and he sat with Cassius in the study for 2 hours, and when he emerged, his eyes were red-rimmed, but his back was straighter than Penelope had seen it in years. He shook Cassius's hand, and then he looked at his younger daughter, his quiet, ledger-carrying, Rosemary-holding daughter, and he said, "Only good." It was, from her father, everything. They married in the village church on a Thursday. In late February, with Mrs. Baird weeping productively in the second pew, and Hatch standing in the back, with his arms crossed, and the expression of a man who had known how this was going to end since approximately the second week. Florinda came, and she was lovely in the way she always was, and she looked at Penelope. Penelope in her good dress, standing beside a man who looked at her like she was the solution to an equation he had been unable to solve. And, for just a moment, her expression was not pitying at all. The estate took 6 years to clear, as the solicitor had predicted. In the 7th year, they rebuilt the west laundry roof properly. In the 8th, the tenant cottages were repaired. In the 10th, the copper beech in the front courtyard was fitted with a bench underneath it, because Penelope had mentioned once that it seemed like a good place to sit. Cassius had listened. He always did.